welcome to the Transformer Exploitation Cafes. This is an interactive session where we present the key outputs of the Transformer project, and we want to show the insights and the knowledge and all the tools that we have learned through the 2 years of the project, and with the aim to help regions to create strategies and help them to accelerate their journey towards net zero transition. These sessions are meant to help you during your break while you're enjoying a coffee to learn something more and to get some insightful knowledge about the regional transformation. We have 5 different sessions of the Transformer Cafes. The first one is about the quantitative regional assessment framework. The second one is about the Transformer toolkit. Third one is about the user forum. The fourth one is about the knowledge hub. And the fifth one will be about the transition readiness tool. So sit back, enjoy your coffee, and listen to our today's presenters who will be talking about the quantitative regional assessment framework. We have with us today 3 experts in urban and regional economics. We have Thomas Meister, who is Transformer Project Coordinator, Matthias Kiese, who is also the Transformer Project Coordinator, and Dr. Judith Wiemann, who is the Scientific Associate. So sit back and listen to what they have to say about the Transformer Project. First, I would like to welcome Matthias Kiese, who can tell us a bit more about the Transformer project.
Yes, thank you, Veronica, and welcome everybody to this webinar. The Transformer project actually started in September 2022 as a 2-year ambitious effort funded by the European Union's Horizon Europe scheme to really develop and test new frameworks to accelerate the transition towards climate neutrality and to decarbonization at the regional scale, because we strongly believe that this is where the action really happens, moving towards this overarching goal. And you can see that we actually selected 4 European regions in 4 different European countries with very different challenges and environments, but they all have quite a huge challenge, a long way to go to reach the goal of transition towards climate neutrality. So that is the Ruhr area in Germany, where we 3 speakers are based. But there's also Emilia-Romagna in Italy, there's Lower Silesia in Poland, and Western Macedonia and Greece. So these are our 4 test beds or transition super labs where we're trying to use the transition super lab methodology to speed up the transition towards climate neutrality. Next slide, please. So what are these transition super labs? The term already sounds a bit like living labs. So the living lab methodology is really the inspiration and delivers the generic tools that we're trying to apply and scale up to the regional scale to really achieve the goal of accelerating transition towards climate neutrality. So these transition super labs are multi-stakeholder arenas that bring together stakeholders from what we call the quadruple helix of universities, civil, public administration, the business sector, and civil society to work together to develop common visions, understandings, and ultimate roadmaps. And we deliver and test the tools in Transformer that they can use in any setting, basically to come together and find novel solutions to speed up the transition towards climate neutrality, including, of course, also the financing and funding that is required to implement these projects.
Next, we have with us Judith Wiemann, who is going to talk a bit more about the TSL approach and explain it in more detail.
Yes, thank you very much, Veronica, and also thank you, Matthias. I think you have mentioned already some of the really important points regarding what we mean by the transition superlab approach, which we will often call a TSL approach in this presentation today. Let's get a bit more into the nitty-gritty of this. Yeah, one of the most important things, and Thomas, Matthias and I, we are geographers, so we really like this aspect of the project, is that we are focusing on a very specific scale, which is the regional scale. And we do hope that this regional scale really can kind of help us to solve some of the problems we have had in the past regarding sustainability transitions at a larger scale. So a lot of the experimentation that is going on regarding sustainability transitions is actually happening on the local scale. And we want to kind of change that towards using the focus on the regional scale here. Why do we want to do that? And how do we want to do that? So how is by a balanced and coordinated solutions for sustainable systemic transformation. So we have this idea that we do need more a more coordinated way of seeing things, and we want to use the regional scale for that. And yeah, it especially helps us also to how do I formulate that best? To address the different dimensions of sustainability within one region. That can be the environmental scale, the economic scale, and the social scale at the same time. And what else do we mean by that? Regions are actually very good, a good scale to see the different dimensions of systems at the same time. So in regions, in comparison to the local scale, where we often only have like one societal system where we can look at, in regions we kind of have cross-sectorial possibilities, because this is where the grand societal systems such as the mobility system, energy system, agriculture, etc., are actually kind of meeting in a relative geographical proximity and really interact in real life configurations or in real life situations in this case. So this is where we are going for by this. And how do we want to really do this? By not just focusing on one single solution, but by developing innovative portfolios of solutions. So solutions in the sector of mobility and transportation connected to solutions in the energy system and agriculture, etc. So this can be multiple systems, cross-sectorial in that sense, a focus on that. To really break away from solutions which kind of only focus on one specific sector, and use this because oftentimes the one specific sector in their transition efforts kind of get stuck. So we have seen that a lot in the past, that, for instance, the transportation sector really wants to go green, but cannot do it without the energy sector going green as well. So this is kind of the idea here, to give a brief example. And so we want to, in this sense, use regions as burning glasses, where we can really focus into those, we call this in transition studies, socio-technical regimes, in multiple socio-technical regimes at the same time. How do we want to do this? By engaging different stakeholders in the process. And this can be business and the other stakeholders Matthias has already mentioned before: academia, civil society, and government. All of them need to be at the table thinking about a region's sustainability transition, and really having all of them also a focus on the needs of the natural environment in general, globally, as well as in the region itself. And then we will we do apply, or we did apply different things we know from living lab methodologies. Many of you might know what living lab methodologies are. Living lab methodologies are really focused on a co-creative process, on workshops, on events where you bring the right people together and then do like creative exercises to envision a future, to make and from there kind of develop solutions, fine-grained solutions for achieving that future in a very structured way. So we apply these in the transition super lab approach with those different kind of stakeholders within the region, and then kind of address this complex of regions as the places where multiple societal systems meet in real life. And from there, we try to use this regional scale to do the rapid sustainability transition we really need for the survival of human life on this planet, if we want to put it like this. And yeah, that is very briefly the transition super lab approach. I think I have really mentioned those points before, but this is really the key point, is that we use regions as burning glasses or arenas for collaborative innovation, and then use this also with living lab methodologies to scale those methodologies up, which is not that easy actually, but I think that will be discussed a bit in some of the other cafes. And from there, develop with those stakeholders together a portfolio of different solutions that can then work together to impact at best the sustainability of the whole region. So what are the challenges of this? The challenges are very clearly that, of course, it's not easy to build up a coalition of stakeholders which are really engaged and can also effectively push things forward. It's difficult to integrate existing networks in the structure, because existing networks have kind of their own interests and established activities, but we really need them to engage to make a lasting impact. And we also need to, it's not easy to develop a common vision in this kind of process, because there are so many different interests at regional scales. And we also have this challenge of implementing feasible governance arrangement for this. So every region is different, has a different set of factors, and it's not that easy to kind of find the way to calibrate this whole thing. But one of the most important things also, which is a very big challenge, and I think we have tried to tackle this at least a little bit with our QRAFT we are going to present today, is the challenge that you really need to discuss first what is it that the region needs to change for a sophisticated plan and vision building in this process, right? So we really need to know what is there in the region, what are the challenges this region specifically faces, in order to then kind of change towards more sustainability. And assessing this in a quantitative manner, we have tried in this approach we will present today.
And now I would like to invite Thomas Meister to talk to us about QRAFT, the concept, and what are the key components.
Thank you very much, Veronica. I want to highlight, first of all, so this is very much connected to other outcomes of this project. So you see here the transformer roadmap, and you will hear also from me about the transition readiness assessment. And I think this is a very good example how connected all these different tasks and outcomes are of this very short 2-year project. And I think this outcome is even more interesting, this quantitative regional assessment framework, because it was actually not foreseen in the grant agreement. So the origin was quite a static task. We wanted to do a quantitative mapping of all EU regions regarding the transition needs. If we talk about climate neutrality, this is of course the focus of greenhouse gas emissions. And we wanted to do a framework where we can assess the transition potentials. But while we started to do this quite static outcome of a complete quantitative mapping, we realized that we can translate that into a tool that could really serve the first steps of this transition superlab process of really gaining an understanding about the transition needs and potentials of the region. And this can really support the development of a vision for the region and also enable different kind of stakeholders with different backgrounds and with different knowledge about the region to really participate in co-creation process. So we started designing this QRAFT as a data-driven understanding of your region, supporting the identification of transition challenges and topics, really to support different stakeholders for co-creating a transition vision for the region. And this is very important, as I mentioned in the beginning. This quantitative assessment is really complementary to what CERT has developed during this project, a more qualitative approach to assess the transition readiness assessment of regions. So the QRAFT and the transition readiness assessment are should be regarded complementary, and there's a huge, I think, really good tool to gain an understanding of your region. So we started developing a few basic criteria. So first of all, this is quite obvious, but the data really had to be available in compiled form for all EU NUTS 2 regions. Partially, we tried to go also to the local level, to the NUTS 3 regions. And this is really important because we want to provide this tool for all EU regions. So it's not only for our 4 transformer regions, but it's supposed to be a tool that can be used by everyone in the EU. Very important is the data has to be quite actual. It's not really interesting to see 10-year-old data, of course, with the exception if you want to see the development of greenhouse gas emissions, for example. And another very important thing is we really need to be certain that the data will be continuously collected and refined. And this specifically refers to the composite indicators that we are using. And the most important underlying criteria, I think, is that we were aiming for a simple approach, because I realized I tried to push more and more indicators into this framework, but then it gets too complex, and most of the stakeholders won't be able to really use this tool because it's hard then to weight the different indicators. And also important is to highlight all this really important work that other people have done that our QRAFT is based on. So all the people who work for Eurostat and created the data, the OECD, the EDGAR database for greenhouse gas emissions. So we heavily depend on all the great work, and we can translate this into our assessment framework. So what are we trying to do in a first step? So if we focus on transition needs, you could use a lot of different kind of indicators. We specifically aim for a very basic approach of first understanding really what is the current state and trends of the regions with regard to climate change transitions. So we look at greenhouse gas emissions per capita and the carbon emission intensity. So the relation between economic output and emissions. And this will give you an idea about your region, and you can benchmark it to other regions. You can really see where do you stand regarding the carbon emission intensity, for example. More important is, I think, the timeline. Because you see, are you achieving a decoupling of economic growth and emissions, which is really crucial to see if you're going into the right direction. And then you can compare yourself with the national average, with other regions, with the EU average, and then you can really understand, okay, do we achieve our goals of really becoming climate neutral? And you can also see, are other regions more efficient, or are they more successful? And then you can really understand, okay, why is this region more successful? And as I mentioned, we focused in the beginning of NUTS 2 level, but we realized it might be really interesting for some regions to really look within the region if there are disparities. So if some of the, let's say, local communities have a different development than others, and then you can really understand or you can really analyze it in depth why some of the regions or local communities develop so differently. And I mentioned in the beginning, we really designed this to support for identifying the most important, let's say, topics. So is it mobility? Is it transportation? Is it the energy sector? So we regard this greenhouse gas emissions on a sectoral basis. And I want to provide you just a few examples from Emilia-Romagna. If you look at the greenhouse gas emissions per sector in the development, you can really see that the transport sector contributes a lot to climate change. And you can also see that their development is not matching the regional goals. And then you can really say, okay, we really need to focus on transport. And from a quantitative perspective, this is where additional data and indicators need to be included. Just want to give you a few examples. You will look at statistics that analyze the motorization rate. You will, of course, look at the very important aspect of road freight transport and railway transport. So you can see, do you underperform in that regard in comparison to other regions? So in Germany, that's really interesting because we have still a very, very strong underperformance when it comes to railway freight transport. That could significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transport sector. And of course, we speak about Emilia-Romagna, and you can see by the color code, air quality is a huge topic. And other data shows that the mobility and transportation sector significantly contributes to the really poor air quality. So we really gain an understanding in Emilia-Romagna, focusing on transport and mobility is of crucial importance, not only for becoming climate neutral, but really for having a sustainable approach. Regarding the transition potentials, we of course don't want to only focus, okay, what are the transition needs, but we want to see it in the bigger picture. So what are the potentials of the different regions to really transform? And for the transition potential, we heavily rely on composite indicators. I think you know a lot of them. The Innovation Readiness Index, for example, is very often cited and also very much promoted by the European Commission. So for really benchmarking what is your innovation capacity in regard to other regions. The regional competitiveness is, of course, very important. We mentioned sustainability needs to really consider economic issues. You really need the resources for having this comprehensive systemic transformation. However, also important or equally important is government performance. We use the Government Performance Index to see if we need to overcome some challenges regarding governing, and also we want to look at what kind of social disparities are in the region that might really pose a challenge for this journey to becoming climate neutral. And these are all aspects that you definitely need to consider by identifying the topic that you're focusing on, identifying the right vision for transition, and to really assess what is our transition potential. And I mentioned in the beginning that we first aimed at quite a static approach. So that would lead you to these tables. So then you can have a comparison. I just included here the composite indicators, and then you compare our 4 transformer regions to each other, and you can see some are more competitive than others, some have a larger innovation capacity. But as we want to really provide this as a tool for all the stakeholders to use, having an Excel file is really not tangible. I don't even want to like to use that. So that's why we translated this data into a dashboard where we try to visualize the data so everybody can use this in a workshop or browse through the data in a little bit more, let's say, tangible way. And this dashboard is currently in the beta version. It will be included in the Knowledge Hub, so it will be accessible for all the people. And I just want to give you one example. You can see the greenhouse gas emissions per capita. You can compare the national performance. You can compare the regional performance, and of course, you can look into the development within your region, because we try to include the 10-year timeline. And we also use that for the GDP, for the gross value added per sector, so that you get a data-driven understanding of your region in comparison to other regions. However, I mentioned at the beginning, even though I think this quantitative approach is very, very good because it's very accessible, you really need to complement it with qualitative assessment. For example, if you look at the government performance index, the rural area, or the next two regions that the rural area consists of, regarding the government performance, we score relatively high, so comparatively high. And that should surprise everyone who's working in the rural area. And this explained by the government performance index is focusing on the impartiality of services, of corruption. And yes, in that regard, the rural area scores comparatively high. But when it comes to really interdepartmental coordination and collaboration and questions like that, this cannot really be assessed in a quantitative way. This is really where you need to have a qualitative assessment based on the questionnaire and expert interviews. And this is really where our QRAFT is connected to the transition readiness assessment, which will be presented by CERT in a different session in these exploitation coffees. To sum up, we think this quantitative regional assessment framework can provide you a very good first step of a data-driven understanding of your region for supporting developing a vision and for identifying really important topics for your transition journey, which then can be complemented by more qualitative assessments. That's in a nutshell the QRAFT. I hope this presentation was not long, but I think we also have some questions because we are aiming for a more interactive session.
Thank you very much, Thomas. We are now coming to the part of our cafes that is the most interactive. We have our three experts, and I would like to ask them to answer a couple of questions that we have prepared for them. So we have seen very interesting presentations from each one of you. Thomas, you have explained very well the QRAFT and how does it work. And I would like to understand a bit better, what are the specific needs that QRAFT fulfills that are in comparison to other frameworks or tools not addressed in them?
Perhaps I will provide the first answer, and then Matthias and Judith will complement that. I would say, first of all, we didn't really have a framework for assessing transition needs and potentials from a quantitative perspective. So there was simply just a gap. But I think another
on the regional scale.
On the regional scale. Very good. Thanks to that. But I want to highlight a different thing because this was, I think, really good co-creation process within the ROP. Because I have the tendency to really get more and more indicators to really, let's say, have the illusion of being more precise and have more explanations. But we soon realized if we include more and more data, it gets a black box, and it's not useful anymore for other stakeholders. Of course, we can interpret our data, but if you look at the composite indicators, for example, some of them only have a dozen indicators. It's still you can still understand how they weigh the indicators, and you can understand why they've chosen some indicators. But if you look at the competitiveness index, for example, there are a few dozen indicators, and then it starts to get a black box, and you just get a score, and you don't really understand what that means. So in QRAFT, we really designed, I think, something that is transparent and really easy to understand and gives you a first idea that you can then discuss with other experts, and then you can really use other services. So it gives you a basic direction. That would be, I think, an important thing that the QRAFT fulfills.
I think at the time that we have been developing the QRAFT as a methodology to assess regions' needs and potentials for transition, we had a really big headache, Thomas, right, regarding this, because it's regions are incredibly complex, obviously, and then the question is, what is really a potential, what is a need for transition, and how to kind of break that down into something that is usable for people and easily usable for people to get an overview of what is happening statistically in their region and to benchmark that against the background of the European Union and what's there about the data. So that was a bit the goal we had, and I think of course there are a lot of backdraws to this, because if you kind of zoom out and get out of the complexity in some ways, you lose information, but at the same time I think managed to make it accessible and easily accessible without having to get into the nitty-gritty of every aspect yourself. And that's, I think, the strength of this assessment.
And if I may just add one thing to that, because I think we discussed in the beginning, so we have quite a background in sustainable perspectives. So really try to develop a framework that's not only assessing climate neutrality as a transition need, but we thought about the different dimensions of sustainability. But then we realized we open up the discussion for example, a just transition. And there are indicators that you can use. The risk of economic deprivation, for example, but then you open up the box for complete different interpretation of data, and then you will surely get lost in the discussion about what kind of indicators are important, what kind of transition needs are important, because then you can also focus on the employment rate, for example. So phasing out of fossil industries will have a huge impact on the employment structure. But if you put that in the center, you have a complete different discussion. So that's why we really specifically said, okay, we want to talk about climate neutrality. We put the greenhouse gas emissions as transition needs in the focus. And the different transition potentials then can add to this discussion. For example, government performance. For example, the social progress that needs to be considered in this transition process.
Maybe by way of summary, I think there are two main contributions that the QRAFT framework actually offers. And the first is really that it is tailor-made to the needs of the TSL approach, because it brings together in an eclectic fashion all the relevant indicators and dimensions of transition, of sustainability transition at the regional scale. So this is a very novel and tailor-made approach. And at the same time, it's very visual. It uses a lot of visual tools with the dashboard actually to also use this as an evidence base in the discussion among the stakeholders in the TSLs, because I think that is quite often missing when you bring together stakeholders from the various fields. There's often quite an emotional discussion about different philosophies, values, ambitions, missions that you might pursue. But the QRAFT also always reminds you that never lose sight of the evidence, actually. Always link your discussion grounded in evidence, and that makes it much clearer to really see the challenge and to also set priorities in the process. And I think this is one of the key values of the QRAFT methodology.
Yeah, it can help regions really frame what is the issue that they can and should address in their region and how they are different or very similar to other regions.
And really also challenge existing narratives. I mean, you mentioned that, but we know if politicians are set for transition goal and vision, it's hard to convince them that this might not be the most important topic. And if you can really provide data and say, okay, I see your vision, but it's not really focusing on that, then you really have a simple way of really reflecting and questioning existing narratives.
In the Transformer project, we had 4 pilot regions. So can you please explain how the pilot experiences influenced everything that was developed in the QRAFT framework, and how it was then refined through testing with the pilots?
And I think regarding the QRAFT, the process was a little bit different because in the Transformer project, due to the time constraints, the 4 Transformer regions already had identified their transition challenge before we started this project, so in the project proposal phase. So what we could do with this QRAFT, we could really reflect if they have chosen the right topic. And luckily I can say, okay, it's really reflected in the data. So we could test the QRAFT by really checking if the regions chose the right topics. And there's another interesting thing. So we got this feedback, of course, from our 4 transformer regions about the usefulness, if they want to adapt that, apply that, got a positive feedback, also try to integrate that into developing the dashboard. But I think equally important feedback was provided by the Transformer user forum, because we really get feedback from outside the consortium. So that was quite a new and novel approach for them. And we got quite a positive feedback. And I just want to highlight one thing, because we realized that this might be interesting, but I was not really aware that it might be so important to really compare their regions to other regions, to really, let's say, provide some political, pressure, I would say. Yes, no, it was a pressure, because the colleague from that country really said it's hard to convince their politicians and the politicians in other regions that they need to go into a specific direction. And they said this quantitative approach, because it's so accessible and you can visualize it that easy, you can really push them to reflect on their narrative. And they said this is huge, very simple but really interesting tools for really steering the conversation to a direction that they are missing so far. So I think in a nutshell, we used the experiences and the feedback not only from our consortium but also from the TSL user forum, and that helped us in refining and first of all confirming that we are focusing on the right data. That was really important. Keep it simple, but also in really developing the dashboard. And I think this product will be quite accessible due to the Knowledge Hub integration, and I think it can have an impact especially for the TSL follower regions.
Yeah, and we who have kind of developed this, I think we have been, we are all from academia, and so I think we sometimes had a bit of a very ambitious but complex approach to things, and kind of the interaction with the different pilot, or with the different regions in this case, not that much with the pilots within the regions, but with the regions, with our practitioners in the project, we kind of grounded the ideas to, okay, we need something very simple, graspable, that can be used for people who are trying to influence the different narratives within their region regarding their sustainability transitions. So I think that was very important to have that kind of exchange on a regular basis regarding this, to not just go for the next fancy concept, but do something that can be used in the daily life of a regional practitioner who kind of wants to influence those processes of sustainability transition.
Great, thank you very much for explaining that, and maybe we can move to the next question. How would you think that the QRAFT will affect the implementation of the follower TSLs after the ending of the project?
If I might start off again, because I know that there will be a consensus, what we really learned in the beginning of the project, it's the really essential aspect of time. You really need to take your time to gain a deep understanding of your region, of transition needs and potentials. Otherwise, you will just use and replicate the existing policies and will go into a direction that might be not the most important one. So this is actually why we developed the QRAFT. So take your time to gain a deep understanding of the transition needs and potential of the regions from a quantitative and qualitative perspective. And you also really have a profound understanding of the stakeholders involved. So my key lesson is really, don't rush this process. You need to take some time in the beginning. And I think for future TSLs, this QRAFT might provide a very easy first step that could really challenge this discussion about the transition, about the vision, about the topics, and could really support all these stakeholder workshops, all these expert interviews, and give them a more, as Matthias said, a more evidence-based basis. So that would be my key lesson and this main takeaway how the QRAFT can support follower T-cells.
Previous approaches to regional development can go back many decades, whatever you look at. And in the past, I studied like the application of cluster strategies at the regional scale for economic development. You name it, you can look at any example. You always see the pattern that really the evidence base is lacking and there's not sufficient analysis, and people just start doing whatever they're interested in. Driven by different agendas and vested interests sometimes, really, but bringing, if you have the ambition to bring really all the stakeholders together, including civil society, and then you have to work towards a common good that needs to have a sound evidence base. And without that, I think you're doomed to failure in your process if you're not clear about where do you start and what are you trying to achieve then. And this is where really QRAFT comes in, because it brings together all the relevant information. And from that evidence base, you have a sound grounding for your TSL process. I think it's really inevitable. And previous experience from regional development across decades actually show that this has often been the missing link or the weak spot in many previous approaches. So I think this should really be taken seriously.
And one of the other things that I think have come out of it as lessons learned for me personally is it's also not enough to just do the analysis, but we also need to kind of communicate and make it easy to understand the data. So kind of translating an index into an aha moment for the regional stakeholders is where the power of analysis really is at creating an understanding of what's going on in a region. So yeah, you can always put another indicator in there, but if people cannot interpret this easily, it does not fit what we need for kind of transition planning, for transition envisioning in a region. So yeah, that's one of the important parts here, to kind of really translate it into something that people can interpret, can understand, and kind of put together the things to really be able to act.
We've heard a lot about the QRAFT, and we know that it has been piloted and tested, but at this point we would like to also understand how scalable is the concept, and what would be then the key factors that will help it with the scalability across regions. Maybe Matthias, you can give us more insights on that.
Yes, of course, I'm pleased to. And of course, scalability is one of the key issues when it comes to the TSL approach, because the ultimate challenge is always to, after developing and testing it in a certain region, you want to scale it up further and roll it out, replicate it across different regions. But of course, for the QRAFT framework, this is quite simple, because you actually can do QRAFT for any region, and Thomas's presentation showed that very nicely, of course, that you have data for all these regions across Europe. So it's easily applicable to other contexts. And when it comes to the geographic scale, it's a different matter, of course, because if you scale it down to smaller geographic scales, then data becomes more and more scarce and limited. So you won't be able to have this wealth of evidence on where you start in your transition process and what the challenges actually are. So it's very scalable, but of course, when it comes to geographic scale, data availability is the precondition, of course, the key requirement for the approach.
May add to that. Of course, it's also scalable because we were focusing on the EU, as it is a EU-funded project, but we had in the TSL user forum colleagues from Turkey, and also data in Turkey exists, for example. So it's scalable to other regions outside the EU as well. And I really want to support Matthias on what he said. If you really go to a smaller scale, then the data will not exist. And this is also very important, it might not be useful anymore. We try to integrate data on another 3 levels, so on the county level. And this is where you still have political administration structure. If you try to really make it, because greenhouse gas emissions, they exist for longitude and latitude. But what would you want to do with this data? So that you know that in your street you have a little bit more greenhouse gas emissions, you will have to scale up at least to the community level to really have establish a living lab or establish really some political surroundings for that. So I think these feasible political implementation possibilities will also define how on how small a scale you can really use this QRAFT.
Yeah, and besides, it is a concept for the data we find in the European Union, of course. Possibly it might be a thing that it could be possible to do that for other regions or major regions. For instance, looking at data from the US and developing something like subnational within for other, other countries or other larger geographical areas like Latin America, etc. That could be a possible scalable goal, but then you would have to really get into the nitty-gritty of the data and kind of basically use what we have done to look at what indicators you find there and what's the quality of the data for those geographic spaces to really scale that to different spaces. And I think it might not be a complete overlap regarding the different indicators, because the European Union, as far as I understand, really has a very specific way also to collect some of the data at least, and it would not be exactly the same.
So we know that you have already some experience with the QRAFT framework, and based on what you have already seen and how the regions have used it and piloted it, are there any recommendations you would like to offer to others that are looking to implement such a framework?
And this is a bit off topic, but I think it's important to kind of focus on that when you think about people kind of applying on and using QRAFT, is that it's a quantitative assessment framework here, and you need a bit more of qualitative assessing too, to really get to the grain of what is going on in a region. And this is a really solid starting point for your region's analysis of their transition needs. But especially the part of potentials is very speculative in quantitative data. And I think it needs to be complemented by a more qualitative analysis framework, and yeah, we have other tools for that.
That was our last question. Thanks to our experts, Thomas Meister, Matthias Kiese, and Judith Wiemann. Thanks to all those that were listening. And if you would like to know more about the outputs of the project, among others also the QRAFT, you can go to the website transformerproject.eu or follow us on social media for any insights and further updates. I'm going to be looking forward to meeting you at the next session of the Transformer Exploitation Cafes. Until then, enjoy good coffee, and have a good day.